Greetings and welcome to our second session into our voyage across all of the various philosophical theories of mind. Last week we discussed substance dualism, the idea, essentially, that our universe, our existence, our world is composed of two fundamental kinds of things, or kinds of substances, the mental and the physical. This week we're discussing property dualism. So our order of events today in exploring property dualism will concern primarily qualia, and the use of qualia to attempt to prove property dualism through three different philosophical thought experiments, which are inverted spectra, philosophical zombies, and Mary's room. And then we will conclude with a discussion of Epiphenomenalism, which is essentially a very difficult problem for property dualism. So, proceeding. What the heck is property dualism? What are we talking about here? So property dualism holds that our existence, as opposed to substance dualism, our existence is composed of not two fundamental substances, but one. That is to say, the mental and the physical are not their own substances, but rather our existence is primarily physical. It is one kind of substance, the physical, and the physical gives rise to the mental. Somehow. So avoiding the problem of mind-body interaction, not saying how the physical gives rise to the mental, only that somehow, in some capacity, the mental arises from the physical. Okay? So therefore, for property dualism, the mental is a property. There is the property dualism. The mental is a property of the physical. However, the mental is not identical or reducible to the physical, despite the fact that the mental arises from the physical. So, existence has one fundamental substance for property dualism, but this substance exhibits two kinds of properties. Okay? So in order for this view to be upheld, in order for property dualism to convince us to be property dualists, it has to essentially convince us, or tell us how, it is that the mental is not reducible to the physical. How does the mental arise from the physical and somehow be something over and above the physical? Enter qualia. So I hope you all remember qualia. Property dualism essentially hinges on qualia, or making arguments surrounding qualia in order to prove that the mental is indeed something over and above, although arising from the physical. So, what again is qualia? It is what it's like to experience something. So, example, what is it like to feel pain? What is it like to feel pleasure? What is it like to taste something sour or sweet? What is it like to be a blind person? What is it like to witness a sunset? And so on and so forth. So, remembering and retaining what qualia is, we proceed to our thought experiments. The first of which is the inverted spectra. So I want you to imagine a hypothetical person named Norman. Norman is a normal guy. He sees colors completely normal. And counter to him, or alongside him, we have Ingrid. Ingrid sees colors in the opposite way to Norman. So she sees colors opposite to the color wheel, or opposite on the color wheel, of what Norman sees. So for example, when Norman looks at the sun and he sees the yellow tinge to it, Ingrid sees a purple tinge. When Norman sees green grass, Ingrid sees red grass. What a world Ingrid's living in, let me tell you. So Ingrid and Norman see colors differently. However, incorporate into this that they, although see them differently, name them the same, right? So they were both born this way. When their parents held up an apple and said, "This is a red apple," they both took whatever they saw to be the color red, and so on and so forth, limes and bananas and whatever else. Mind you, despite the fact that they name them the same, they see them differently, right? So imagine further that when scientists examine along the eyes, the brain cell, or excuse me, the color receptors along the eyes, and look at the brains of Norman and Ingrid, all the physical properties are the same. So the question here from inverted qualia is something different? Zing, 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 and you know what the qualists, can you call people that are for qualia qualis? We're gonna do it. The qualists say, of course, qualia is different. Alright, so let's make an argument, shall we? Let's see how the qualists, the qualist property dualists would make an argument here. So, premise number 1. It is conceivable for a person to have all the same physical properties as me, but have different qualia. Premise 2. If it is possible for a person to have the same physical properties as me, but different qualia, then it is possible for this person to exist. Premise 3. If it is possible for this person to exist who has all the same physical properties as me, but different qualia, then qualia are not physical properties. Conclusion. Qualia are not physical properties. The problem for the inverted spectra is, of course, as we hopefully remember, it relies on modality, or it is a modal argument. So that is to say, it relies on the presumption that because something is conceivable, i.e. that someone can exist apart from me who has the same physical properties as me, but nonetheless differs in mental properties. So because that situation is conceivable, it's therefore possible, and therefore, since that's possible, it must be possible or the case from that the mental is not reducible to the physical if I have all the same physical properties but different mental properties in someone, right? So, so the problem with modality, right, is that it's problematic empirically. Alright, it's not problematic logically, so that's why you're probably thinking, well, we already went through the problems with modal arguments, why the hell are we bringing them up, right? Like, so who cares if it's logically true, but if it's not empirically true, then why the hell are we talking about it? Well, quick little philosophy session, right? Very important thing here about logically true versus empirically true. So this is a matter of sound versus valid, or valid versus sound arguments. So a logically true argument is an argument that is true by way of the words involved, or the meanings of the words involved, and or the argument structure. So such an argument that is true in this way is called a logically true or valid argument. Now, in order for that to be a very strong argument, or a very believable, true absolutely, or so we think, argument, it has to be also a sound argument. And a sound argument is an empirically true argument. So that is to say, it's true by way of the meanings of the words involved. Oh fuck, I just copy and pasted the same thing on the... Ignore that! It's not correct. I forgot to fix that. Empirically true argument, not what it says over there, my bad. I forgot to correct that. An empirically true argument is an argument that is true by virtue of the world. It's true in existence. We can look to experience to confirm the trueness of this argument, right? So a logically true argument is a valid argument, and an empirically true argument is a sound argument, right? So in order to have the supreme argument status, it needs to be both valid and sound, right? So you're probably thinking, okay, so where does modality fit? Why are we talking about modality? So modal arguments are still made and going to be discussed quite a bit because they're arguments that can be made in ways that are always logically valid, right? The problem with them is that they can't necessarily be made empirically valid because we can't necessarily look to the world to confirm them. They're matters of logic, right? So why, again, you're probably thinking, do we take these things seriously? Well, besides the fact that philosophers love logical games, we have essentially another logical game for you. So, in the field of symbolic logic, or in the field of logic, scientific study of logic, put it this way. In any given world, let's say our world, that world, any possible world, is governed by a set of rules or laws, like gravity, for example. And within this world, within its rules, anything logically is possible, so long as there is not a rule stating otherwise, right? So herein, therein, that is the reason why philosophers still consider arguments that are just logically true, right? Because by virtue of symbolic logic, the logical structure believed to govern worlds, it could be true given the reason, or given the fact that there's no reason that says, or no rule that says it cannot be true. Okay, so let's consider another argument that's trying to prove that the mental is something over and above the physical. This one is philosophical zombies. So let's consider again Norman and Ingrid. Norman, again, has a normal range of qualia. Normal guy, feels things, sees things, there's something it's like to be Norman. Ingrid, on the other hand, behaves just like Norman, and is physically the same as Norman, but she has no qualia. Ingrid is what philosophers like to call a philosophical zombie. That is to say, she acts normal, but she has no sensation of what it's like. There is nothing it's like to be Ingrid in the same way there's nothing it's like to be a rock or a piece of wood. It's just a thing that's there. Kind of, if we want to relate it to popular culture, I believe this is also an NPC, essentially. So despite Norman and Ingrid's difference in qualia, imagine that a brain scan reveals them to be the same. When they each stub their toe, they both cry out in pain. When you ask them what color something is, they both respond the same way. So you're probably thinking, well, it's kind of hard to comprehend how Ingrid could function at all with no qualia. How could something function completely unconscious? Philosophers like to argue that there are lots of processes that take place unconsciously without you knowing it, such as memories, for example. Similarly, think of a phone or a computer. It can store information without necessarily having something it's like to be that thing, right? So my computer can store all this data and information. That doesn't mean there's anything there's like to be a computer. So very well, a philosophical zombie could exist. So let's plug that bad boy into an argument structure, shall we? So, premise number 1. It is conceivable for there to be a person that has all my physical properties but lacks my qualia. Premise number 2. If it is conceivable for there to be a person that has all my physical properties but lacks my qualia, then such a person is possible. If it is possible, premise number 3, for there to be a person who has all of my physical properties but lacks my qualia, then qualia cannot be physical properties. Conclusion, qualia are not physical properties. Again, as I said, we meet modality. And the reason that modality will continue to be brought up is because it's trying to solve things just by virtue of the meanings of the words and the argument structure involved. And it's trying to prove something within the bounds of logic that we can't at this time necessarily prove through empirics. So whether or not you believe this argument is contingent on how much truth or how much thought or how much strength you lend to things that operate solely in the sphere of logic. So in a perfectly logical world where there's no rule for why this can't be true, then it's necessarily possible within that world. We're gonna leave it at that for now. Next experiment. Mary's room, right? So we met Mary. We have met Mary before. We've met her in our introductory session, but we will quickly recap this in order to make an argument, which we didn't do in our introductory session. So, Mary. Mary is a color scientist. However, she has been brought up her whole life in a black and white room. From the moment she was born, from the moment she came out the womb, she was born into a black and white room. Before being born, she had been also injected, just as a precautionary measure, with special substance, which makes her see herself and everything else also in black and white. Everything she sees in black and white. Mary has never seen in color. But, in her whole life in this black and white room, she has been trained to have all of the relevant knowledge about color, right? She knows everything about the properties of light that gives rise to color. She knows everything. So the question is, since she's never seen color, does she really know everything? And the Qualia says, hell no! She does not know everything there is to know about color because she has never experienced color itself. So let's make an argument. So this argument, we will use physicalism. So physicalism is the idea that everything is physical. Everything is entirely physical properties, right? Okay, so premise number one. If physicalism is true, that is, if all properties are physical properties, then Mary knows everything there is to know about color. Premise two. Mary does not know everything there is to know about color. For example, she doesn't know what it's like to see the color red. Conclusion. Physicalism is false. Not all properties are physical properties. There is at least one non-physical property, brackets, a red qual, which is qualia, singular rather than plural. That's a pretty good argument, right? So that one is not resting on, well, I mean, it's kind of resting on modality in the sense that you have to accept the Mary's room hypothetical situation. But this argument itself is, again, a logically valid argument. And I think it's one of the better arguments we've come across here. However, one thing we do need to be on the lookout for always is the explanatory gap, which underlies all of this. All the time. There's so much explanatory gap happening, I have whiplash from the explanatory gap. From trying to cross the gap. From attempts to ignore the gap. I don't know. Example, okay? Watch out for this. Premise number one. If qualia are identical to any physical properties, then there can be a scientific theory that explains qualia solely in terms of physical properties. Premise number two. There can never be a scientific theory that explains qualia solely in terms of physical properties. Conclusion. Qualia are not identical to any physical thing. They are a kind of non-physical property. Right? So, the explanatory gap, hopefully we remember it. The idea that because we don't have information for something right now, or a scientifical physical explanation for something right now, that it therefore will never have it. In this case, qualia are non-physical entities. So what do you think? Was there any explanatory gaps occurring earlier in our session? In any of those arguments? Do any of them escape it? I'll let you decide. So those were the main thought experiment arguments for property dualism, right? So what they all tried to do was try to prove that the mental is not reducible to the physical, right? That the mental, although it arises from the physical, is something over and above the physical, not identical or reducible to the physical. So the biggest problem, despite what we've hitherto discussed, for this view is something called Epiphenomenalism. So most philosophers believe that property dualism necessarily leads into Epiphenomenalism, and let us now see why that in itself is problematic. So Epiphenomenalism is the view that qualia are not causally... I forgot to Google how to actually pronounce that. I want to say efficacious? Efficacious? We're going to say efficacious. Causally efficacious. Efficacious. Epiphenomenalism is the view that qualia are not causally efficacious properties. In order to understand the difference between causally and non-causally efficacious properties, consider throwing a baseball at a window. Right? So to grasp an idea of this, that qualia are not causally efficacious, Picture a baseball. I have just thrown a baseball through a window. Let us consider the dimensions of the baseball, which led to the window being broken. So there are certain things about this baseball, right? It's round, it has a mass, it's white, it's got some red on it. So what are the properties of the baseball that made it break the window? So obviously the color doesn't matter, whether it's white, green, blue, black, whatever, does not matter. Maybe it's signed by a famous baseball player, also doesn't matter. The only things that are causally effacious about the baseball are the fact that it has mass and that it's been chucked at something that can smash through. Applying this idea to qualia, right, on an epiphenomenalist view, the reason you cry when you stub your toe on something, I mean, assuming you're that big of a pansy, is not because of the painful qual of stubbing your toe or the painful qualities associated with stubbing your toe. The reason you cry is merely the result of nerve endings and electric signals occurring which produce a programmed response. So, how does exactly property dualism lead to this view that quals or qualia are not causally effacious? Efficacious? Or really, fuck it. Since property dualism holds that there is only one fundamental substance, the physical, and this physical substance can be explained entirely by physical processes. So given that, and then since qualia are not physical, then necessarily they are not involved in physical processes, right? And since physical processes are the only things in a physical world that are causally effacious, and if qualia aren't physical, then they necessarily can't be causally effacious. You see what I'm saying here? So then the other problem with this is consider that zombie thought experiment, right? So that's a good embodiment of epiphenomenalism. So if there can be a being, me, which I presume to have qualia, and there can be another being, Ingrid, who, although acts like me, responds just like me, isn't always behaviorally just like me in responses, but lacks qualia. If that can exist, then that necessarily means that my qualia are not a part of how I behaviorally act in the world. Right? Because if this zombie over here having no qualia can act just like me, how are my qualia causally effacious at all? Moreover, given this, on this view, how could you even know whether or not you're a zombie? So in its attempts to prove that the mental isn't reducible to the physical, that it's something over and above the physical, it actually ends up proving, essentially, that thereby, the mental can't actually cause anything. The only thing property dualism really proves is that the mental is completely pointless in our existence. That really we could all just be programmed zombies. And we really have no way of knowing whether we or other people were. Well, okay then. So, no to substance dualism. Very unlikely. No to property dualism. Hopefully unlikely. Next week we'll be discussing idealism, solipsism, and panpsychism. So be sure to come back as we continue our voyage throughout these perplexing theories of mind.